Victor Rourke didn't wait for the ranch to die. He killed it himself, one missing supply shipment at a time. The morning Clara Whitmore's stagecoach rolled into Caldwell territory, Victor was already in the bank, leaning across the desk of a man who owed him 3 favors, sliding a document forward with 2 fingers like it was already signed. "Move the deadline up," he said. 60 days. Not 90. The banker looked up. "Nathan Caldwell has until spring." "Nathan Caldwell," Victor said quietly, "has until I say he's done." He straightened his coat, picked up his hat, and walked out into the Montana cold without looking back. He never saw the woman stepping off the stagecoach across town, the one with one trunk, worn boots, and eyes that measured everything she looked at. He should have looked back. Before we go any further, if you're watching this for the first time, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell, because the story you're about to hear is only the beginning. Every week we bring you stories like this one, tales of ordinary people who refuse to be broken. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to 1878 and to the woman nobody saw coming. The stagecoach stopped at the edge of a property that looked like it had already given up. Clara Whitmore pressed her face close to the window glass. Not because she was eager, but because she needed to see the truth before she stepped into it. That was a habit her father had beaten into her, not with his hands, but with 20 years of watching him read a room before he entered it. "Look first," he always said. "You can't unsee a thing, but you can choose what to do with it." What she saw made her stomach tighten. The main fence along the road was missing 3 posts. A wagon sat tilted on one wheel near the barn entrance, and nobody had moved it. The mud around it had dried and cracked, which meant it hadn't moved in weeks. The roof of what might have been a storage building had partially caved in on one side, and there was a smell carried on the wind that she recognized immediately. Sick animals. Not dead yet, but working on it. She pulled back from the window and sat very still for a moment. This is worse than the letter said. The letter had said, "Struggling operation, 22 workers, need a capable woman to help manage the household and the crew." The letter had not said, "We are 30 days from collapse, and I am too proud to admit it." Men never did. The driver called down from above, "This is it, ma'am, Caldwell Ranch." She didn't wait for him to help her down. She opened the door herself, stepped onto the running board, and dropped to the ground, and immediately sank 3 inches into mud that hadn't been managed around the entrance road. She pulled her boot free with a sucking sound, looked down at it, and pressed her lips together. "Fine." She lifted her trunk herself. The driver cleared his throat. I have it?" she said. Nathan Caldwell was not waiting at the door. He was in the barn. She found him because she followed the sound of something hitting wood, a flat, rhythmic sound, like a man chopping at something that wasn't responding the way he wanted. She walked around the tilted wagon, avoided a patch of ground that looked unstable, and pushed open the barn door to find a man in his late 30s attacking a fence post that was already broken, splitting it further with the back of an axe handle like it had personally wronged him. He didn't hear her come in. She stood there for a moment, trunk at her feet, studying him the same way she'd studied the property from the stagecoach window. He was bigger than she'd expected, wide through the shoulders, strong in the way that comes from actual work rather than show. But his movements were choppy, the kind of choppy that comes from exhaustion, layered on top of exhaustion, when a man's body keeps going because his brain hasn't given it permission to stop. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. He spun around so fast he nearly dropped the axe handle. For 1 second, pure startlement crossed his face, and then it locked down behind something else, something practiced and hard. "You're early," he said. "The stage was on time," she said. "I believe that makes you expecting me late." He stared at her. She stared back. He had dark eyes, the kind that had seen too much weather and not enough sleep, and there was a scar along his jaw that had healed crooked. He hadn't shaved in at least 4 days. "Nathan Caldwell," he said finally, like he'd remembered he was supposed to introduce himself. "I know who you are," she said. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I answered your letter." "I know who you are too." Then we're off to an efficient start. She looked around the barn without waiting for him to offer. Her eyes moved quickly. Hay stores, low. Stall conditions, poor. The smell she'd caught from the road was stronger in here. She turned toward the back of the barn and saw them. 4 cattle in the far stalls, and even from this distance she could see the dull coat, the way they stood with their heads down. "How many?" she asked. "How many what?" "Sick animals." Nathan's jaw tightened. 4 cattle, possibly 2 more developing symptoms. It started 2 weeks ago. "What treatment have you tried?" "We've been managing it." That was not an answer. She turned to look at him directly. "What treatment have you tried, Mr. Caldwell?" The jaw tightened further. "Why does that matter right now? You just arrived." "It matters because if it's what I think it is, the 2 you said are possibly developing symptoms are already sick. They're just not showing it fully yet." She walked toward the back stalls. "Has there been bloody discharge? Labored breathing at night?" He followed her and she could feel the resistance coming off him like heat. "You know cattle disease?" "I know a lot of things." She stopped at the nearest stall and leaned over the gate, looking at the animal carefully. Up close, she could see what she'd suspected. "My father ran a supply operation for 15 years. We supplied feed and worked directly with ranchers. I spent more time in barns than in parlors." She straightened up. "You need to separate these 4 from the others completely, and you need to do it today. Tonight at the latest. I have 22 men, and I'm not one of them." "Then tell one of them." She turned to face him. "Do you want me to explain why, or do you want to argue with me about whether I have the right to suggest it?" Nathan Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind those dark eyes. Not quite anger, not quite respect. Something caught between the 2 that hadn't decided which way to fall yet. "Walter!" he called out. A man appeared from the far side of the barn, older, somewhere in his late 50s, with a face like dried leather and the kind of stillness that meant he'd seen every kind of bad news and was no longer surprised by any of it. He looked at Clara once, measured her completely in about 2 seconds, and then looked at Nathan. "This is Walter Briggs," Nathan said. "My foreman." "The 4 cattle in the back stalls," Clara said to Walter directly. "They need to be moved to an isolated pen tonight. Separate water source, no shared feed. Can you do that?" Walter looked at Nathan. Nathan gave the smallest nod. Walter looked back at Clara. "I can do that," he said. No argument, no elaboration, just the thing itself. She liked him immediately. The wedding, if you could call it that, happened the following morning in the front room of the ranch house, with a traveling preacher who smelled like he'd been in a saddle for a week, and 2 ranch hands as witnesses, who kept looking at the door like they were wondering if they could leave. Nathan stood next to her with his arms at his sides and his face arranged into an expression that communicated, "I am doing what is necessary." Clara stood next to him with her hands folded in front of her and thought, "So am I." There was no ceremony worth speaking of. There were words, there were the 2 of them saying the required things. There was a moment when the preacher asked if anyone objected, and one of the witnesses coughed, and then it was done. Nathan shook her hand afterward, actually shook her hand, like they'd completed a business transaction, which she supposed they had. "I'll show you the rest of the property," he said. "I've already walked most of it," she said. He stopped. "When?" "This morning, before sunrise." She'd been up since 4. Couldn't sleep in a new place, never could, so she'd used the time. "I want to see the smokehouse." "The smokehouse is—" He stopped. "I know what it is," she said. "I want to see it anyway." Botet. The smokehouse sat at the edge of the property like something that had been trying to walk away and given up halfway. The door hung on one hinge. The roof had been patched badly with wood that didn't match and had since split again along most of the seams. Inside, the racks were still there, iron, so they'd survived. But the wood sections had rotted, and there was evidence of animals having been in and out for what looked like years. The ventilation system, which she could see had once been decent work, was completely blocked. She walked in, turned a slow circle, and looked at everything. Nathan stood at the door. It's been out of use for 3 years, he said. Before that it was working, but after my father died and the debt started climbing, there wasn't... He stopped himself. It wasn't a priority. It should have been, she said. Well, flat. A lot of things should have been. She ran her hand along the iron rack nearest to her. Solid, good weight. Who built this? My father. He knew what he was doing. Nathan said nothing. She turned around and looked at him standing in the doorway with the gray morning light behind him and the expression on his face that he probably thought looked like indifference but was actually something close to grief. He had watched this place fall apart piece by piece and hadn't been able to stop it, and that kind of helplessness leaves marks on a person whether they admit it or not. She didn't say that. Instead, she said, 3 weeks. He blinked. What? Give me 3 weeks and I'll have this running. She looked back at the racks. We can cure enough meat before winter to feed the crew through the worst months and have product to sell by spring. The iron is good. The structure is repairable. The ventilation is blocked but not destroyed. She turned back to him. 3 weeks. Nathan stared at her. That's not possible, he said. Why not? Because... He gestured at the state of the building. Look at it. I am looking at it. Clara. He said her name like he was trying it out and hadn't decided yet if it fit. I appreciate that you want to help, but the reality of this ranch is that we don't have the resources, the time, or the men, she said. I'll need 6 of them, and I'll need them to actually work, not to stand around deciding whether to listen to me. I'll need a supply run to town. I'll make you a list, and I'll need you to stay out of the smokehouse while I'm working in it. The silence that followed was the particular kind that comes when someone has just said something that lands hard and neither person knows yet what direction the aftermath is going to go. Nathan Caldwell looked at his wife, the woman he had known for approximately 18 hours, and said, You're serious. I don't say things I'm not serious about, she said. It's a waste of time. He looked at the smokehouse. He looked at her. He looked at the smokehouse again. 6 men, he said. 6. And a supply run. I'll have the list ready by noon. Another long pause. A muscle in his jaw moved, and I stay out of it. You can come in when it's running, she said. Not before. Nathan Caldwell rubbed the back of his neck and looked up at the patched roof with its split seams and its 3 years of abandonment, and said, very quietly, almost to himself, My father built this. I know, she said, and I'm going to bring it back. He looked at her then. Really looked at her, the way he hadn't yet since she'd arrived. Not measuring her like a new piece of equipment, not checking whether she was going to be a problem, looking at her like he was trying to decide whether she was the most reckless person he'd ever met or something else entirely. He didn't say which he decided, he just said, noon, and walked back toward the ranch house. The 6 men Nathan sent her were not his best. She understood that immediately. Walter confirmed it, not with words, but with the way he stood slightly to the side when he brought them over, like he wanted it on record that he hadn't chosen them. There was Eli Parker, 19 years old with red hair and the nervous energy of someone who'd been told his whole life that he wasn't quite smart enough. There was a man named Dutch, who was probably 40, and moved slowly on purpose, the way people do when they've decided not to commit to anything until they see which way the wind is blowing. 2 brothers named Cal and Roy Ferris, who came as a unit and spoke to each other in half sentences that excluded everyone else. A man named Gus, who had a bad shoulder and was clearly being sent because Nathan didn't know what else to do with him. And finally a young man named Thomas, maybe 22, who looked at Clara when he arrived with the specific expression of someone who has already decided to be difficult. Ma'am, Thomas said, in the tone that meant the opposite of respect. Clara looked at all 6 of them. They looked back at her. We're going to start by pulling everything out, she said. All of it. Every piece of rotted wood, every piece of debris, everything that's not iron. Stack it outside to the left. I'll need to look at it before anything is disposed of. Thomas crossed his arms. That's going to take all day. Then we'd better start, she said. We're not exactly... Thomas. She said his name calmly. Not loud, not hard, just certain. I didn't ask for your estimate of the timeline. I told you where to start. If that's going to be a problem, you're welcome to tell Mr. Caldwell that you'd rather not, and he'll send someone else. She looked at the others. Same for anyone else. Nobody moved. Nobody left. Dutch, after a moment, picked up the nearest piece of rotted wood and carried it outside. And then the rest of them followed. By the fourth day, they had cleared the smokehouse completely, repaired the roof structure, rebuilt the damaged wood sections using material from the stack outside that Clara had sorted and identified as salvageable, and replaced 2 of the ventilation channels with new wood that Eli Parker had cut himself after Clara showed him exactly what angle and measurement she needed. Eli had turned out to be the best of them. He was fast, and he listened, really listened, not just waited for the instructions to be over. When she showed him something once, he didn't need it shown again. She'd caught him staying late the second evening, measuring things she'd already measured, checking her calculations against his own. "What are you doing?" she'd asked. He'd looked up, guilty. I just wanted to make sure I understood. "You're checking my work," she said. He went red. That's good," she said. "You should. Don't ever do work you can't verify." She sat down next to him and looked at his calculations. They were right. "Where did you learn to calculate like this?" "I didn't. Not really." He kept his eyes on the paper. I work things out." "You have a good head for it." He looked up then, surprised by it, like a compliment was something he had to prepare for. "My last foreman said I overthought everything," he said. "He was wrong," she said, and stood up. She heard him exhale slowly behind her as she walked away. Walter Briggs found her on the 6th morning, standing outside the smokehouse in the pre-dawn dark with a cup of terrible coffee and her notebook. He came and stood next to her without being invited. She had noticed that about him. He never waited to be invited anywhere, but he also never went somewhere he wasn't needed. It was a precise kind of instinct. "Rourke's man was in town yesterday," Walter said. She looked at him. "Which man?" "He has a few." Walter drank his own coffee. It was clearly also terrible. He didn't seem to notice. "This one talks to the bank. Name's Garrett. He asks questions, writes things down, goes back to Rourke." "What kind of questions?" "How the ranch is doing, whether there's been any improvements, whether there are any deals in progress." Walter paused. "The usual things a man asks when he's trying to figure out how long something has left." Clara looked down at her notebook, at the calculations she'd spent the last 2 evenings refining. "How much does Nathan owe?" she asked. Walter was quiet for a moment. "That's a question for Nathan." "I'm asking you." Another pause. "More than he said. The original debt was bad enough, but there have been adjustments to the terms. Things that shouldn't have been able to be adjusted. Someone adjusted them. Someone with the right relationships at the bank." Walter looked at his coffee cup. "This is not just a struggling ranch, Mrs. Caldwell. There are people positioned to take it the moment it fails, and they have been very careful to make sure that it fails." She was quiet for a long time. The dark of the Montana morning sat around them, cold and absolute. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. "Since before Nathan's father died," Walter said. "Maybe before that. Hard to say when a scheme starts. Easy to say when it finishes." "It hasn't finished." "No, ma'am." He looked at her. "Not yet." She closed her notebook. 3 weeks, she said. "The smokehouse will be running in 3 weeks." "I believe you," Walter said. "That surprises you?" "No," he said. "That's why I believe it." He walked back toward the barn, and Clara stood in the cold with her terrible coffee and her notebook, looking at the smokehouse that was slowly becoming what it was supposed to be, and thought about a man named Victor Rourke, who was somewhere in the dark deciding how long the Caldwell Ranch had left. "He doesn't know I'm here yet," she thought. "He will." The smokehouse started producing smell before it produced product. That sounds wrong until you understand what it meant. The first real smoke, the kind that came from a fire built right, fed right, drawing through a ventilation system that was finally doing what it was designed to do, rolled out of that building on the morning of day 11 and drifted across the yard in a slow, heavy wave that stopped 3 ranch hands in their tracks. Clara was inside, monitoring the draw, watching the way the smoke moved through the chamber. She had her notebook open and was making marks every few minutes, temperature estimates based on the color and behavior of the smoke, airflow readings. She'd devised her own method for measuring because there was no instrument for it. Her hair was pinned back and she had soot on her left forearm and she hadn't eaten since before dawn. Eli stuck his head in the door. "Mrs. Caldwell, the men outside—" "I know," she said without looking up. "They're just standing there." "Let them stand." He was quiet a moment. "Dutch said it smells like his grandmother's kitchen." She looked up then, not because of what Dutch said, but because of the way Eli said it, like he was surprised that a hard man like Dutch would admit to something like that, like maybe he was surprised himself. "Good," she said. "That's exactly what it should smell like." She went back to her notebook. What she didn't tell Eli, what she didn't tell anyone, was that her hands had been shaking when she built the first fire that morning. Not from cold, from the specific fear that comes when you have made a promise out loud to a man who has nothing left to lose, and the moment has arrived to find out if you can keep it. The ventilation had drawn correctly. The temperature had held. The smoke was exactly what it needed to be. She'd stood there for about 10 seconds, letting herself feel that, and then she'd opened her notebook and gotten back to work. Nathan came that evening. She'd told him to stay out of the smokehouse until it was running, and he had respected that. More than she expected, honestly. She'd half anticipated him finding a reason to come in on day 3, day 5, day 8, but he hadn't. She'd seen him sometimes from the corner of her eye, standing at a distance, watching the building without appearing to watch it. He was better at hiding his concern than most men, but she'd learned to read the particular way he held his shoulders when something was weighing on him. He knocked on the doorframe, knocked, even though the door was propped open. She found that detail unexpectedly decent of him. "Is it running?" he asked. "Come in and see," she said. He walked in slowly. She watched him take in the space. The rebuilt racks, the repaired wood sections, the ventilation channels Eli had cut, the fire burning correctly in the pit, the first batch of beef hanging and taking on color. The smokehouse that had been a ruin 3 days after she arrived was now operating. Not perfectly. She'd have told you herself that the left side ventilation was still pulling slightly uneven, and she intended to correct it on the next cycle, but operating. Nathan stood in the center of the room and didn't say anything for a long time. She let him have it, the silence. "My father built this in 1861, he said finally. "He and 2 other men. Took them most of a summer." "I know. The joinery on the original sections is very good. Whoever taught him knew what they were doing." Nathan looked at one of the original iron racks, one of the ones that had survived because iron survives everything. "He taught himself," he said. "He didn't. We weren't a family that had people to teach us things. He figured it out from a book and from failing at it twice first." Clara looked at the rack, looked at Nathan. "That explains why it's better than most I've seen," she said. "People who teach themselves figure out the reasons behind the rules. People who are taught just follow the rules." He looked at her. That look again. The one she'd seen in the doorway of the smokehouse on her first morning, trying to decide what category to put her in. "It's going to work," she said. Not a question. "You believe that?" "I don't say things I don't believe. I told you that." He nodded once, slowly. "I'm starting to understand that about you." He looked around the space one more time. "Clara." He stopped. "What?" "The men who doubted you. They worked hard," she said immediately. "All 6 of them. Whatever they thought at the start, they did the work." He looked almost surprised. "Even Thomas?" She almost smiled. "Almost. Thomas came around on day 3. He just didn't want anyone to notice." Nathan was quiet again. Then he said, "Thank you." It was plain. No ceremony to it. Just the thing itself, said by a man who clearly didn't say it often and meant it in the full weight of every place he didn't put it. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "Walter told me about Rourke." The change in Nathan Caldwell was immediate and total. The thing that had been opening in him over the past few minutes, some door cracked just slightly, slammed back shut. His jaw set. His eyes went flat. Walter shouldn't have. Walter was right to, she said. I'm your wife. I am working on this ranch. I need to understand what we are actually fighting. You don't need to be involved in. Nathan. She kept her voice level, the way she'd learned to do when a conversation was about to go sideways if she let any heat into it. I already am involved. I was involved the moment the stagecoach dropped me at your gate. The only question is whether I'm involved with the full picture or only part of it. She paused. Half a picture gets people killed on a ranch, you know that. He stared at her. She stared back. Victor Rourke, he said finally, like he'd been keeping the name behind his teeth and it cost something to let it out. He's based in Helena. He runs, legally on paper, he runs a land development company. Buys property, develops it, sells it on. Nathan's voice had gone quiet in a way that was worse than angry. Unofficially, he targets ranches that are struggling, finds them when they're vulnerable, makes sure they stay that way, and then acquires them at collapse price when the bank calls the debt. Make sure they stay that way, Clara repeated. How? Supply lines. He has relationships with most of the major suppliers in this region. When a ranch he's targeting places an order, Nathan stopped, pressed his lips together. The order doesn't always arrive, or it arrives short, or it arrives damaged, and by the time you've sorted it out and reordered, you've lost 2 weeks, and your men are working short, and he exhaled. It compounds. Everything on a ranch compounds. Has he interfered with our supplies? 3 times in the last 4 months. 2 feed deliveries short, 1 medical supply for the cattle that never arrived at all. He looked at her. That's why the cattle got sick. Not because we didn't try to treat them, because what we needed to treat them with never showed up. Claire's hands were very still at her sides. And the bank? He has a relationship with someone at the Billings branch. I don't know who, I can't prove who. But the terms of my father's debt, the terms that were set when my father was alive, they've been adjusted twice since the debt transferred to me. Adjusted in ways that shouldn't have been possible without my signature, and I never signed anything. But you can't prove that either. No. Flat. Final. I can't prove it. The fire in the smokehouse pit shifted, and the smoke moved through the chamber, and the smell of it sat around them both, that good deep smell of something being preserved rather than lost. We have 11 weeks before the next deadline, Nathan said. If we can't cover the payment by then, the bank calls the full debt, which means Rourke gets what he's been positioning for. Then we need 11 weeks to be enough, Clara said. Clara, what we produced in this first run, how much can we sell and to whom? He looked at her for a moment, then reluctantly, like a man picking up a tool he wasn't sure would hold. There's a buyer in Billings, Hennessy. He supplies provisions to 3 mining operations and a military outpost. If the product is quality, it will be quality. If it is, Nathan said, with the careful emphasis of a man who had been burned by optimism before, he could take significant volume, but he's been burned by unreliable suppliers. He won't commit without seeing it himself. Then we invite him to see it himself, Clara said. It's not that simple. Why not? Because Hennessy doesn't make social calls to ranches he doesn't already do business with. You can't just write the man a letter and expect him to. I wasn't going to write him a letter, Clara said. You were. Nathan opened his mouth, closed it. You know him? She asked. We've met, once, 2 years ago, before things got bad here. He knew my father vaguely. Then it's not a cold introduction, it's a reconnection. She looked at him steadily. Write tonight. Tell him the smokehouse is running. Tell him you have product worth seeing. Tell him exactly what he'd be buying and why it would make his supply problems simpler. She paused. Can you do that? Nathan looked at her. I can write the letter, he said slowly. Whether he responds is another thing. Write it well enough and he'll respond, she said. He almost said something else. She could see it. Some reflex of doubt or argument that he'd carried so long it tried to surface on its own, but he stopped it. I'll write it tonight, he said. The problem with Roy and Cal Ferris announced itself on day 14. and it announced itself in the specific way that ranch problems usually did. Not loudly, but in something small that was actually something large. Clara had sent Cal to town for additional salt and 2 specific items she'd written on a list. He came back with the salt and without the other 2 items, saying the supply store had been out. She accepted that without comment, added the items to a second list, and sent him back the next morning. He came back again without them. She thanked him, set the list aside, and the following morning she went to town herself with Eli driving the wagon. The supply store had both items, had had them for weeks. She stood at the counter with the 2 items in her hands and kept her face very calm and asked the man behind the counter, a tired-looking fellow named Peterson, who clearly wanted no part of whatever he was now in the middle of, whether there had been a Cal Ferris in recently. Peterson got very interested in something behind him. "Mr. Peterson," she said, still calm, "I'm not going to make trouble for you. I just need to know." He turned back. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, "He came in. He didn't ask for those items." She paid for her things and went out to where Eli was waiting with the wagon. "Drive," she said. Eli drove. He didn't ask what had happened. He'd gotten good at reading when to ask and when to wait. After about a mile, she said, "Do you know why Cal Ferris didn't bring back what I needed?" Eli kept his eyes on the road. "I've got a guess." "Tell me." A pause. "There's been talk," he said carefully, "among some of the men, not all of them, but some, about how things are going." He shifted the reins to one hand. "Some men think that if things are going well, it changes what the ranch is. Who's in charge of what? And some men would rather the ranch fail on terms they understand than succeed on terms they don't." Clara looked at the road ahead. "And Roy Ferris? Is he part of this talk?" Eli was quiet long enough that she had her answer. "What do I do about it?" she asked, not to Eli specifically, just out loud, to the problem. "I don't know," Eli said honestly. "But I think if you go at them directly, they'll deny it and it'll make them worse." "What would you do?" He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. "I'd make it so the work they're doing doesn't matter enough to sabotage," he said. "Move them somewhere it doesn't affect the smokehouse. Give them something else." She looked at him. He went red again. "I'm probably wrong." "You're not," she said. She didn't move Cal and Roy immediately. She did something more precise. She restructured the workflow so that neither of them was involved in any step that required her to rely on them for external supply runs or communication. She gave them real work, hard, physical, necessary work that kept them busy and away from anything critical. She did it in a single afternoon without making an announcement about it, without calling a meeting, without confronting anyone. Thomas noticed. He caught her alone near the south fence on the evening she made the changes. "You know what they did?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I know what I know," she said. "You going to tell Nathan?" She looked at him. Thomas had gone from her most resistant worker to something she'd describe, carefully, as an unwilling ally. He didn't like her particularly, but he respected what she was building, and on a ranch, that counted for more than like. "Why?" she asked. "Do you think I should?" He thought about it. Nathan would fire them. And then what? And then we'd be 2 men short in the middle of a critical... He stopped. His expression shifted. "You already thought through that." "I think through most things," she said. He was quiet. Then, "What if they do something worse?" "Then I'll handle it then," she said. "Differently." Thomas shook his head. Not in disagreement, but in the particular way of someone recalibrating something they thought they understood. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I know," she said, and went back to work. Jamdan. Walter brought the news about Rourke on a Tuesday, which was the same day Hennessy's response arrived. Walter came first. He came in the way he always did. No rush, no announcement, and found her checking the second batch of curing product and said simply, "Rourke's man Garrett was at the bank in Billings yesterday. Spent 2 hours there." Clara didn't stop what she was doing. "Do you know what they discussed?" "No. But a banker who spends 2 hours with a man like Garrett isn't discussing anything good." Walter leaned against the doorframe. It means Rourke knows something is changing here, and he doesn't like it. Good, she said. Walter looked at her. Mrs. Caldwell, I want to be plain with you because I think you deserve plain. Victor Rourke is not a man who responds to setbacks by walking away. He responds by applying more pressure. I understand that. I don't think you understand the specific kind of pressure he's capable of. Walter's voice didn't change its register, which somehow made it worse. 3 ranches before this one. 2 of them failed before the deadline. The third one, he paused. The owner tried to fight back publicly, made accusations, went to the town council, tried to get people to listen. Another pause. Burned down, the barn first, then the house. The smokehouse was quiet around them except for the sound of the fire in the pit. They never proved it was Rourke, Walter said. They never prove anything with men like that. That's the design. Clara set down her notebook very carefully. Why are you telling me this now? Because you need to know what kind of war this is before you decide how to fight it, he said. She looked at him. Walter Briggs, who had stayed on this ranch through 3 years of decline and watched it fall apart piece by piece and hadn't left. There were men who stayed somewhere because they had nowhere else to go, and there were men who stayed because they believed something was worth staying for. She'd been trying to figure out which kind Walter was. She thought she knew now. Do you have a family, Walter? She asked. He seemed slightly caught off guard. Had a wife, she passed some years back, 2 sons, both grown, both elsewhere. Why are you still here? He considered that longer than she expected. Nathan's father was a fair man, he said finally. In a territory where fair is harder to find than water in August. I worked for him for 11 years. When he died, it seemed wrong to leave the place go under without at least trying to stop it. He looked at the rack of curing meat. I didn't know how to stop it. I'm a foreman, not a... He gestured at the space around them. Whatever this is the plan, she said. Yes, he said. I'm beginning to see that. Nathan appeared in the doorway then, holding a letter. His face was doing something that Clara had not seen it do before, something that was fighting hard to stay in place. Hennessy wrote back, he said. She waited. He's coming, Nathan said. 3 weeks from Thursday. He wants to see the operation and taste the product. He looked up from the letter. He said... Nathan stopped, cleared his throat. He said the way I described it in the letter. It sounded like the ranch was actually going somewhere. Walter made a small sound that might have been satisfaction. Clara picked up her notebook. Then we have 3 weeks to make sure we give him something worth the trip, she said. She said it plainly, the way she said most things. But she was aware, in the way you're aware of a temperature change, that something in the room had shifted. Nathan was standing straighter than he had been when she'd arrived. Walter had the look of a man who has been braced for bad news for so long, he doesn't quite know what to do when the news is different. And Eli Parker appeared at the door behind Nathan, saw the faces in the room, and said, Did something happen? Yes, Clara said. We have a deadline. Let's get back to work. She walked past all 3 of them into the cold Montana afternoon, notebook in hand, already working the numbers on what 3 more weeks of production could yield and whether it would be enough to show Hennessy what he needed to see. Behind her, she heard Nathan say to Walter quietly, Is she always like this? And Walter said, I believe so. And Nathan said nothing after that, but when she glanced back once, just once, from the corner of her eye, he was folding Hennessy's letter carefully and putting it in his coat pocket like it was something worth keeping. That was enough for now. The first sabotage happened on a Wednesday. Clara knew it was sabotage before she even crossed the threshold of the smokehouse that morning because the smell was wrong. Not wrong like something had failed on its own. Equipment failures have their own particular smell, their own logic. This was wrong in the way that only happens when someone has made it wrong deliberately. The ventilation draw was blocked. The fire in the pit had been tamped down sometime in the night, and the temperature in the chamber had dropped low enough that the third batch, their best batch yet, the one she'd been planning to show Hennessy, had been sitting in conditions that were no longer safe. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked in, checked every rack, assessed every piece, and made herself write down exactly what she saw in her notebook before she allowed herself to feel anything about it. Eli arrived 10 minutes later, took one look at her face, and said, "What happened?" "The ventilation was blocked during the night," she said, "and the fire was interfered with." He went to the pit and crouched down, looked at it. "This wasn't an accident," he said. "No." "How much do we lose?" "All of this batch." She closed her notebook. "We have to start again." Eli stood up slowly. He looked at the racks. 2 weeks of careful work. And she saw something move across his face that was close to what she was feeling, but younger, rawer, without the years of discipline she'd put over her own reactions. His hands tightened at his sides. "Who did this?" he said. "I don't know yet." "Do you have a guess?" She looked at him. "I have several," she said, "and I'm not going to act on any of them until I know which one is right." He looked like he wanted to argue that. She could see it. The 19-year-old part of him that wanted to find the person responsible and say something about it at volume. But the part of him that had been listening to her for 3 weeks won out. "What do we do right now?" he asked. "We clean this out," she said. "We rebuild the fire correctly. We check every channel in the ventilation and we find where it was blocked and we fix it." She looked at him steadily. "And then we start the next batch. We've got 12 days until Hennessy arrives." "I know exactly how many days we have," she said, and rolled up her sleeves. She told Nathan that evening. She'd waited until after dinner, until the ranch house was quiet, until it was just the two of them at the table with the lamp burning low and his account books open in front of him, which was where she always found him in the evening, bent over numbers that never quite worked out, running the same calculations hoping the answer would change. "The third batch is lost," she said. He looked up. She told him what she'd found. His face went through several things in quick succession: shock, then anger, then something cold and very controlled that settled over him like a lid being placed on something boiling. "Rourke," he said. "Probably someone working for Rourke," she said. "Not Rourke himself. He doesn't get his hands into things directly." "It doesn't matter who physically did it." "It matters very much who physically did it," she said. "Because if it's someone on this ranch, then we have a problem I need to deal with differently than if it's someone who came in from outside." Nathan's jaw went tight. "You think it's one of our men?" "I think the ventilation channels are not visible from outside the property at night," she said. "I think someone who didn't know exactly where to find them wouldn't have known where to block them. I think the fire was tamped rather than extinguished, which suggests someone who understood what they were doing. They wanted damage, not obvious destruction that would be found too quickly." Nathan stared at her. "That's a careful kind of sabotage," he said slowly. "Yes," she said, "it is." He pushed back from the table and stood up, and the anger that had been under the controlled surface came out in the way he moved. Not explosive, but contained and hard, like pressure behind a wall. "I'll talk to every man on this ranch tomorrow." "Please don't," she said. He turned. "Clara, if whoever did this knows we suspect, they'll be more careful, or they'll do something worse before we can catch them." She kept her voice low. "Nathan, I need you to trust me on this. Let me find out who it was." "And how are you going to do that?" "By paying attention," she said. "The same way I've done everything else." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp put shadows under his eyes that made him look even more tired than he was, which was already considerable. "You can't do everything on this ranch," he said. It came out not as criticism, but as something closer to worry. "I'm not trying to do everything," she said. "I'm trying to do the things that need doing." He sat back down, put his elbows on the table, and pressed his hands over his face for a moment. "We have 12 days," he said into his hands. "I know. If the next batch isn't ready—" "It will be ready," she said. "I'll be working around the clock if I need to." He dropped his hands, looked at her. "I hate that you have to." It was such a plain thing to say, and it surprised her. Not because she doubted he meant it, but because she hadn't expected him to say it out loud. Nathan Caldwell, she had learned, carried a great deal of feeling in absolute silence. It came out in how he handled things, in small choices, in the way he'd taken Hennessy's letter and put it in his coat pocket like it was worth protecting. It almost never came out in words. She didn't know what to do with the words when they came. So she said, "Get some sleep, Nathan. The numbers will still be wrong tomorrow." And she stood up and she went back to the smokehouse. She worked until 2 in the morning. She found her answer on the second day after the sabotage, and it came from Dutch. She hadn't expected Dutch. Dutch was the slow-moving, watch-and-wait man who had been the second person to actually pick up a piece of wood on the first day she'd asked them to work. He wasn't someone she'd counted as an ally exactly, but he wasn't someone she'd counted as a threat either. He existed in a middle space she'd classified as uncertain but functional. He found her alone behind the smokehouse, checking the external section of the ventilation channels, and he stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands, doing something with the brim that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Dutch," she said. She'd never learned whether Dutch was a first name or a last name. She wasn't sure he knew either. "Mrs. Caldwell." He cleared his throat. "I got something to say, and I'm going to say it fast because I don't want to think about it too long, or I'll decide not to." She stopped what she was doing and gave him her full attention. "It was Roy Ferris," he said. "Not Cal. Roy did it on his own, I think, though Cal knew about it after. Roy went in the smokehouse around 2 in the morning 3 nights back. I couldn't sleep. I was outside. I saw him." He turned his hat brim once more. "I didn't know what he was doing in there. I found out the next morning, same as everybody else, when the damage was found. And I've been sitting on this for 2 days, and I can't sit on it anymore, because what he did is going to sink this ranch, and I've been on this ranch for 9 years, and I don't—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I don't want it to sink." "Did anyone put him up to it?" Clara asked. Dutch hesitated. "I'm not going to use your name," she said. "I won't tell Nathan who told me or how I found out. You have my word." He looked at her. "There was a man in town," he said. "Garrett. He's been around before, asking questions. Roy drinks at the saloon on Fridays. Most of the men do. And Garrett was there 3 weeks back. They talked. I don't know what was said." He paused. "Roy's been owed money for 3 months. The ranch has been short on pay. A man who's owed money and feels overlooked. He's not hard to find if you're looking for that kind of man." Clara stood very still. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that." Dutch put his hat back on. "I don't want any trouble over this." "The trouble isn't yours," she said. "Go back to work." He nodded and walked away with the relieved posture of someone who has just set down something heavy. She handled Roy Ferris the following morning. She did not do it the way Nathan would have done it. She didn't fire him outright, didn't confront him in front of the other men, didn't make it a spectacle. She found him alone at the water trough before the rest of the crew was fully up, and she came up beside him and said quietly, "I know it was you." Roy went very still. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, keeping her voice at a normal register, conversational, like they were discussing something completely ordinary. "You're going to work every day between now and Hennessy's visit like your life depends on this place surviving. You are not going to be inside the smokehouse at any time for any reason. You're not going to speak to Garrett again. You're not going to tell anyone we had this conversation." Roy turned to look at her. He was a big man, mid-40s, with the specific resentment of someone who believed his situation should have been better than it was. "And if I don't?" "Then I tell Nathan exactly what you did," she said, "with evidence. And you leave this ranch with nothing in the middle of winter, with a reputation that follows you to every operation within 100 miles. She looked at him steadily. "I don't want that. You don't want that. And this ranch can't afford to be 2 men shorter right now." She paused. "But it can afford to replace 1 man who makes me do this conversation twice." Roy stared at her. She stared back. "We understood?" she asked. A muscle in his throat moved. "Understood," he said. She walked away. Her hands were steady. She didn't let them shake until she was around the corner of the barn where nobody could see her, and then she leaned against the wall for about 30 seconds and breathed, and then she straightened up and went to start the next batch. The rumor reached town before the end of that week. She heard it from Eli, who'd made a supply run and come back with his face arranged in the careful way of someone carrying news they don't want to deliver. "People in town are saying the Smokehouse product is no good," he said. He handed her the supplies and didn't quite meet her eyes. "That you've been overstating what you're producing, That Hennessy's going to come out here and find nothing worth buying. Clara took the supplies. Who's saying it? I heard it from Peterson at the supply store. He said he'd heard it from, he didn't say who, but he looked uncomfortable about it. Eli paused. It's the kind of thing that spreads, Mrs. Caldwell. Once people start saying something, I know how rumors work, she said. She did. She'd watched her father's business get attacked by one, a story about contaminated product that wasn't true but cost him 3 months of orders before he could prove otherwise. By the time he proved it, 2 of his regular buyers had found other suppliers and didn't come back. This was the same move. Softer than burning a barn, but aimed at the same thing. She went to find Nathan. He was in the north pasture, mending fence, which was Nathan's version of the way she worked in the smokehouse when something was bothering him. Physical work. Something with a clear outcome. I've heard, he said, before she could start. What do you want to do? She asked. I want to ride to Helena and... He stopped, drove a fence post with more force than necessary. I want to do several things that would make everything worse. Yes, she said. So let's not do those. Clara. He turned to face her, and for the first time she saw real exhaustion in his face. Not the functional exhaustion of overwork, but the deeper kind. The kind that comes from fighting the same battle over and over against an enemy who has more resources and fewer scruples. He's going to keep doing this. Every time we build something up, he's going to knock it back down. The rumor today, something else tomorrow. I cannot keep running a ranch while someone is systematically destroying every step forward we take. I know, she said. Then what do we do? She'd been thinking about this for 2 days. She'd been thinking about it while she rebuilt the fire and reset the ventilation and started the new batch, while she handled Roy Ferris at the water trough, while she lay awake in the small hours listening to the Montana wind work its way under the ranch house eaves. We document everything, she said. He looked at her. What? Every batch, every output, every improvement. I've been keeping records in my notebook. But I mean real documentation, signed and dated. Numbers, processes, results. Every time we produce something, we write down what we produced, how much it weighed, what condition it was in, what price it would sell at. She held his gaze. Rourke is building a picture of a failing ranch. We build a picture of a functioning one, with evidence that exists outside of our word against his. Nathan was quiet. And the rumor? The rumor dies when Hennessy comes and sees the operation himself, she said. That's why Rourke is pushing this now. Says he's trying to make Hennessy doubt us before he arrives. If we can get Hennessy on this property, inside that smokehouse, tasting that product, no rumor is going to matter. And if Hennessy doesn't come, if the rumor gets to him first... She didn't answer right away. The wind moved across the pasture and the cattle in the distance shifted, and the late afternoon light came down at the angle that made Montana look, for a brief moment, like something that was worth every bit of what it cost. Get used to it, she said. She wrote to Hennessy that evening. She wrote plainly and factually and without sentiment. She described the operation, the output, the documentation she was keeping, the quality of the product. She mentioned, without laboring it, that there were people in the territory who had a financial interest in misrepresenting the ranch's status, and that his visit would speak for itself better than any letter from either direction. She asked him to come as planned. She read it once, sealed it, and gave it to Nathan to dispatch in the morning. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page and began the documentation she'd described. Every batch, every number, every result. She wrote in her clearest hand, which was very clear. Her father had insisted on it. If it's worth knowing, he'd said, it's worth writing so someone else can read it. She was halfway through the second page when Nathan knocked on the doorframe of the small room she'd claimed as a workspace. There's something else, he said. She looked up. Walter just came in from checking the outer perimeter. Nathan's voice was careful, the way it got when he was managing something he didn't want to drop. The gate lock on the north access road was cut. She set down her pen. When? Sometime today, while we were all working. Someone was on the property. Yes. She was quiet. The cut lock meant access. Access for what? They didn't know yet. But the escalation was clear. First the rumor, and the same day, something physical. 2 moves at once. Rourke is speeding up, she said. Or he's got someone telling him we are, Nathan said. They looked at each other across the small room. Check the cattle, she said. All of them, tonight. Nathan nodded and left. She heard his boots on the floor, then the door, then his voice outside calling for Walter. She picked up her pen and kept writing. The documentation wasn't just a record anymore. She understood that now, with the particular clarity that comes when a fight stops being theoretical and starts being real, it was evidence. And evidence was the only weapon that Victor Rourke couldn't buy, couldn't block in a supply shipment, couldn't tamper with in the night. But only if she kept building it. Only if nothing stopped her before Hennessy arrived. 8 days left. She turned to a new page and kept writing. The cattle were fine. That was the first thing Walter reported back that night, and Clara let herself feel about 4 seconds of relief before she understood what it actually meant. Whoever had cut the lock on the north gate hadn't come for the cattle. They'd come to look, to assess, to count what was in the smokehouse and see how far along the operation was. Rourke was taking inventory of what he was up against. She told Nathan that interpretation the following morning, and he stood with his coffee going cold in his hand and worked through it the same way she had, arriving at the same place. He's deciding whether to escalate, Nathan said. He's already escalating. The rumor, the lock, those are escalation. What he's deciding is how much further he needs to go. She looked at her documentation notebook, which now had 4 dense pages of records. Which means he's not certain yet. If he were certain we were going to fail, he wouldn't bother. He'd just wait. So we're worrying him. We should be worrying him more, she said. Nathan set down his coffee. What do you need? 2 more men on overnight watch, rotating, not Cal or Roy. She paused. And I need the documentation witnessed, signed by someone other than me, someone whose word carries weight. Walter, Nathan said immediately. And you, she said, both of you, every entry from here forward, date, signature, what was produced. She held his gaze. If this ever ends up in front of anyone, a banker, a judge, the town council, I want a record that 3 people signed every page. Nathan looked at the notebook. Something moved through his expression. The recognition of what she was building and what she was preparing for, which were 2 different things running on the same track. You think it might come to that, he said. Not quite a question. I think Victor Rourke has done this before, she said, and I think the reason he keeps doing it is because nobody has ever been in a position to prove it. She picked up the notebook. We're going to be in that position. 5 days before Hennessy's visit, Thomas came to her with something he'd been sitting on for at least 24 hours. She could tell by the way he looked when he found her, like a man who has argued himself out of something several times and finally run out of arguments. I've got a cousin, he said. In Billings. Works at the freight office. She waited. He told me something last week. I didn't know if it mattered, so He stopped. I should have told you sooner. Tell me now, she said. There's been a shipment registered with Hennessy's account, Thomas said. Cured beef. Coming from a supplier out of Miles City, registered 3 weeks ago, right about when Nathan's letter went out. He looked at her directly. Someone registered a competing supply with Hennessy's name on it, scheduled to arrive the same week as his visit here. Clara went very still. The idea being, she said slowly, that when Hennessy arrives, he already has a supply contract in motion from somewhere else. So even if he's impressed by what we have, he has no immediate need. That's what it looks like, Thomas said. Does your cousin know who registered it? Company name, Ridgeline Provisions. He'd never heard of it before. Thomas looked at his boots. Neither had I, but my cousin said it was set up recently, new registration. She had never heard of Ridgeline Provisions either. She filed that fact in the part of her mind where she kept things she intended to find out. Thank you, she said, for telling me. I should have told you the day he told me. Yes, she said, but you told me today, and today still helps. He nodded and left, and she went immediately to find Walter, because Walter had been in Montana longer than anyone else on the ranch, and knew the territory in ways she was still learning. Walter knew exactly what Ridgeline Provisions was. It's a shell, he said, with the certainty of someone who has seen the mechanism before. Rourke sets them up when he needs them. Paper company, nothing behind it. He used the same method with at least one of the other ranches. registered a competing supply under a fake operation, undercut the deal, and by the time anyone figured out the company didn't really exist, the moment had passed. Can we prove the connection to Rourke? Walter thought about it. Not quickly. Not easily. He looked at her. But Hennessy is a businessman. He's been in this territory long enough to have heard things. If someone told him Ridgeline was worth looking into before he committed, he'd look into it, she finished. A man who supplies 3 mining operations and a military outpost didn't get there by ignoring due diligence, Walter agreed. She went back to her workroom that afternoon and sat down and wrote the 3rd letter to Hennessy. The first had been Nathan's, warm, re-establishing contact. The second had been hers, factual, direct, countering the rumor. This one was something different. She wrote it carefully, taking longer than she usually took, because the line between useful information and unverifiable accusation was thin, and she needed to stay on the right side of it. She told him she'd become aware of a recently registered supply concern called Ridgeline Provisions. She told him she had no information about its operations or reliability. She told him that, in a territory where legitimate operations tended to have established histories, a new registration in the same product category, appearing at a particular moment, seemed worth examining before any commitments were made. She told him this not to influence his decision, but because she believed he was the kind of man who preferred to have complete information. She read it twice. It said exactly what it needed to say without saying one word more than that. She sealed it and gave it to Eli to take to town before the post closed. Hennessy arrived on a Thursday morning, which was the day he'd said he would arrive, which Clara took as a good sign. A man who keeps his schedule is a man who intends to do business. He was not what she expected. She'd built a picture of him from Nathan's description. Serious businessman, hard to impress, burned by unreliable suppliers. And the picture was accurate as far as it went. But it left out that he was about 60, with white hair and the kind of open, direct face that usually belonged either to very honest people or to very good actors, and that he arrived with only one other man, which meant he wasn't making this trip as a performance. He shook Nathan's hand, assessed the property with quick, experienced eyes, and then looked at Clara and said, "You're the one who wrote me the letters." "2 of the 3, she said. "Nathan wrote the first. I know his handwriting." He studied her for a moment. "The 3rd letter." "I wanted you to have the information," she said. "You wanted me to look into Ridgeline." "I wanted you to decide whether you wanted to look into it," she said. "That's your business, not mine." Something shifted in his expression, approval, or the beginning of it. "I looked into it," he said. "Registered 6 weeks ago. No history of operations, no established facilities, no verifiable product." He paused. "Interesting timing." "We thought so," she said. He looked at her for another moment. "Show me the smokehouse," he said. She walked him through everything. Not the way she would walk someone through who needed to be impressed. No performance, no salesmanship. The way she'd walk through it with Walter or Eli. Here's the ventilation system and why it draws the way it does. Here is the temperature maintenance and how we monitor it without instruments. Here is the curing process, the timeline, the outcome at each stage. Here are the records, every batch, every weight, every date, every signature. She put the documentation notebook on the table she'd set up for exactly this moment and opened it to the first page. Hennessy picked it up. He read slowly. He turned pages without hurrying. He asked 2 questions during the reading. Specific, technical questions about curing times and salt ratios. And she answered both directly without dressing up the answers. Then he set down the notebook, walked to the nearest rack, and cut a piece of the current batch himself, and ate it standing there in the smokehouse without any ceremony. He chewed it slowly, looked at the rack, looked at Clara. "How much can you produce per month at full operation?" he asked. She told him. He did some calculation in his head. "You can guarantee that output consistently?" "I can guarantee the process," she said. "The process produces that output. Weather is its own thing, and cattle get sick and equipment breaks. But the process is sound." He almost smiled at that. "That is a more honest answer than most suppliers give me." "Most suppliers answer the question they wish you'd asked," she said. He looked at Nathan, who had been standing just back of Clara the entire tour, in the particular posture of a man who has decided to let someone else handle something and is mostly succeeding at trusting that decision. "She always like this?" Hennessy asked Nathan. So I'm told, Nathan said. Hennessy looked back at Clara. I lost a supply contract 2 years ago because a ranch I was buying from turned out to be exactly where yours was 3 months ago. Good intentions, no documentation, and when things fell apart, they fell apart overnight. He tapped the notebook. This is not that. No, she said. It isn't. My concern, Hennessy said, and he set down the notebook and folded his hands in front of him in the way of someone about to say the thing that actually matters, is not the product and not the operation. It is what I've heard about the conditions the ranch is operating under, the debt situation, the pressure from certain parties in the territory. He looked at Nathan. If I commit to a supply relationship and the ranch folds in 8 weeks, I'm back where I started. The ranch won't fold, Clara said. Mrs. Caldwell, I appreciate your confidence, but confidence is not... The debt deadline is in 7 weeks, she said. We need a certain amount to cover the payment. I know what that amount is. I know what our current production value is. I know the gap between them. She looked at him steadily. If you commit to purchasing our next 3 months of production, we cover the payment with enough to stabilize operations. I have the numbers here. She set a second document on the table next to the notebook, the calculations she'd been running and rerunning for 2 weeks. Check them. Hennessy looked at the document. He didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at her instead. You're asking me to be part of saving this ranch, he said. I'm asking you to buy a quality product at a fair price, she said. What that does for the ranch is a consequence of good business, not a favor. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the document. The wait while he read it was the longest Clara had sat still in weeks. She kept her hands in her lap and her face arranged, and she looked at the ventilation channels and the iron racks and the fire burning correctly in the pit. And she thought about her father sitting across a desk from a buyer in the last year of his business, making a case for something he knew was good. And she thought, I learned this from you. I hope it works the way it worked for you in the beginning when things were still working. There's a gap, Hennessy said. She came back to the room. Between the production value and the payment amount? Between what 3 months buys you and what you actually need. He set the document down and pointed to a figure on the 3rd page. This number. You've been conservative in your estimates. If you produced at the middle range rather than the low range, this gap closes. She looked at where he was pointing. He was right. She had been conservative. She'd been conservative because conservative was defensible if something went wrong. And she'd learned from watching her father that the promises you couldn't keep cost more than the ones you never made. I was being careful, she said. I understand why, he said, but I've seen your operation and I've read your documentation and I've tasted your product. The middle range is reasonable, not optimistic. He looked at her. You're allowed to believe in what you've built. Something tightened in her chest. She pressed it flat and looked at the numbers. If I commit to the mid-range and fall short in a bad month, she started, then you contact me, you tell me, and we adjust. Hennessy's voice was matter-of-fact. I'm not Rourke. I don't benefit from you failing. I benefit from you succeeding because then I have a reliable supplier. He closed the document. That is, if we can come to terms. She looked at Nathan. Nathan was looking at her. He gave the smallest nod. Not the nod of someone handing off a decision, but of someone who has decided to trust the person making it. Tell me your terms, she said to Hennessy. They negotiated for an hour and a half. It was not comfortable. Hennessy was not a man who gave ground easily, and Clara was not a woman who asked for what she didn't intend to get. They went back and forth on price per pound, on delivery terms, on what constituted acceptable variance in monthly output. Nathan sat at the side of the table and didn't say much, and brought fresh coffee from the ranch house, which was the most useful thing anyone had done all morning. When they were done, the agreement was written out in Clara's clearest hand, signed by both parties, and witnessed by Walter, who signed his name with the slow, deliberate care of someone who understood what a signature meant. Hennessy shook Nathan's hand. Then he shook Clara's, which was not common, and he did it with the same grip and the same directness. If things were different and you were looking for work, he said to her, I'd offer you a position. I have work, she said. I know. He picked up his copy of the agreement. That's why I'm glad I came. He left with his associate, and Clara stood in the yard watching the wagon diminish down the ranch road, and Nathan came and stood beside her. They stood there without speaking for probably 2 minutes. "How much does this cover?" Nathan asked finally. She told him the number. He was quiet. "Nathan? That's not—" He stopped. "Clara, that's not quite enough. The payment is—" "I know what the payment is," she said. "I've known the number since the 3rd day I was on this ranch." She turned to look at him. "The Hennessy contract covers most of it, the gap that's left. I have a plan for that." He looked at her, tired, uncertain, hopeful, in the way that hope looks when it's been beaten back enough times that it doesn't quite trust itself anymore. "What plan?" "I need to make a trip," she said, "to Billings." "For what?" "There's a buyer there. Not for the Smokehouse product, for the cattle we've been holding back from sale because you needed them for the herd." She'd been tracking this for 2 weeks, hadn't said anything because she needed Hennessy's deal settled first. 4 of the recovered cattle and 2 of the older ones you were going to sell at spring market. If I take them to Billings now, before the market gets flooded with winter sellers, the price is better. Billings is 3 days out in this weather. I know. The roads past the second ridge are— Nathan. She met his eyes. "I've been on worse roads." He looked at her, then he looked at the ground. Then he looked at her again and said, "I'm coming with you." "I know you don't need me," he said with a quiet forcefulness that surprised her. "That's not the point. You're not making that trip alone. The roads are bad, the weather is turning, and Rourke has people who watch the routes out of this territory." He paused. I know that I stepped back and let you lead on most of this. And I should have. You know what you're doing, but this is different. This is 2 people, or it's something else." She looked at him. The wind came across the yard and the smell of the smokehouse came with it, and she thought about what Walter had said about a ranch that had been burned to the ground because one person fought alone. 3 days out, 3 days back, she said. "We leave the day after tomorrow. Walter stays in charge." "Walter stays in charge," he agreed. "And Roy Ferris doesn't go near the smokehouse while we're gone. Roy Ferris can mend fence on the south perimeter for 6 days." She almost smiled. "Fine." He almost smiled back. Almost. "I'll tell Walter tonight." That evening she went through the documentation one more time. All of it. Every page, every signature. She made a second copy in a separate notebook. Slower work, but necessary. 1 copy would stay at the ranch. 1 would come with her. She was on the last page when she heard Nathan in the next room, moving around. Not pacing. Nathan didn't pace, just moving, the way people move when their mind is working and their body needs to do something with it. She finished the last entry, signed it, dated it, and closed the notebook. Then she knocked on the wall between them. The movement next door stopped. "Get some sleep," she said through the wall. "Billings is a long road." A pause. Then his voice low. "You too." She blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark thinking about the road to Billings and the gap between what Hennessy had paid and what the bank required and the cattle she'd move and the numbers she'd calculated and how close everything was. Not comfortably close, not safely close, but close in the way that a thing is close, when every piece has to work and nothing can afford to go wrong. She thought about Victor Rourke and Helena, getting reports, recalculating. She thought about the documentation notebook sitting on the table in 2 copies, all those pages of signed evidence that hadn't existed a month ago. You can't buy what that is, she thought. You can't block it in a supply shipment. You can't cut a lock and walk in and take it in the night. She closed her eyes. In the morning, they would start preparing for Billings. And somewhere in Helena, a man who had built his life on other people's failures was looking at a ranch that wasn't failing the way it was supposed to, and making plans she couldn't yet see. She'd find out what they were when she got to Billings. She always found out eventually. The road to Billings was exactly as bad as Nathan had said it would be. They left before dawn on a Thursday, 6 cattle loaded and moving slow behind the wagon, the temperature sitting at the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but works its way through every layer you're wearing by the end of the first hour. Clara had her second documentation notebook in the saddlebag beside her. Nathan drove. Neither of them talked much in the early dark, which suited her fine. She had a lot to think about, and she thought better without words filling the air around her. By mid-morning, they'd made decent progress, and by mid-morning she'd also worked through most of what was sitting in her head, and the silence had shifted from practical to something else, the kind that happens between two people who have been in close quarters under pressure for long enough that the silence itself carries information. "Tell me about before," Nathan said without looking away from the road. She glanced at him. "Before what?" "Before Montana. Before the letter." He kept his eyes on the horses. "You said your father ran a supply operation. What happened to it?" She was quiet for a moment. She didn't talk about this easily, not because it was too painful. She'd processed most of the pain into work, the way she processed most things, but because the story made her sound like someone asking for sympathy, and she had no interest in that. "He got sick," she said, 2 winters ago. By the time we knew how sick, the business was already slipping. He'd been managing things while he was ill, and not telling anyone how ill, because that was his way. He believed you kept going until you couldn't, and then you found a way to keep going after that. She paused. "When he died, the business had more debt than I knew about. I spent 8 months trying to cover it. I sold what I could sell, I renegotiated what I could renegotiate, and when I'd done everything I could do and it still wasn't enough, I let it go." Nathan was quiet. "Answering your letter wasn't—" She stopped, found the right words. "It wasn't desperation, exactly. I had other options. They were just smaller options, less interesting." She looked at the road ahead. "Your letter said you needed someone practical, someone who understood how an operation worked. Most letters said they needed a cook or a woman to keep house. Yours said something different." "I didn't know what I needed," Nathan said. "I knew what I didn't have." "That's the same thing sometimes." He looked at her then, just briefly, just a glance, then back to the road. "I should have told you more in the letter, about Rourke, about the real state of things." "Yes," she said. He pressed his lips together. "I was ashamed of it, how bad it had gotten. My father built this place from nothing, and I'd watched it come apart, and I kept telling myself it was circumstances, it was bad luck, it was the market. And most of that was true. But some of it was that I didn't know how to ask for help. I just kept carrying it by myself and hoping the weight would get lighter." "It doesn't get lighter that way," she said. "No," he said, "it doesn't." The road curved and the second ridge came into view, and the sky over it was the particular gray that meant weather coming. Not today, but maybe tomorrow. And Clara looked at it and made her calculations and said, "We need to move faster through the next section." Nathan moved them faster. They reached the Billings stockyard on the afternoon of the second day, having pushed hard and stopped only when the horses needed it. Clara was stiff all the way through, and her hands were cold past the point where gloves helped, and she was in no mood for anything complicated. The buyer at the Billings stockyard was a man named Carver, mid-50s, comfortable in the way that men who have made steady money for a long time become comfortable, without ostentation but with the settled assurance of someone who has not worried about a bill in many years. He came out to look at the cattle with the unhurried manner of someone who knew the seller needed him more than he needed the seller, which was true, and which was the part of this Clara had spent 2 days preparing for. She let him look. She didn't rush him or talk while he walked around the animals. She'd learned from her father that talking while a buyer examined product was a kind of begging, and begging moved the price down. When Carver came back to where she and Nathan were standing, he gave a number. It was low. Not insultingly low. He wasn't the type for insults. It made the negotiation messier, but low in the practiced way of an opening that expected to be pushed. "That's the winter price," Clara said. "It is winter," Carver said pleasantly. "It is," she agreed. "And the nearest alternative buyer is 40 miles further on roads that are about to get significantly worse." She let that sit for a moment. "We both know what these animals are worth on a spring market. I'm offering you a winter deal at a price that reflects actual value rather than seasonal opportunity, and I'm offering it to you rather than making that 40-mile trip." Carver looked at her. She looked back. "I've been doing this for 20 years, he said. "I can tell,"
she said. "That's why I'm not wasting your time with theater. Just the number." He gave her a new number. Better. Not yet where she needed it. "Closer," she said. "Not there." He studied her for a moment, then looked at Nathan. "She negotiate everything like this?" "As far as I can tell," Nathan said. Carver made a sound that might have been a laugh. "One more," he said, and gave her a final number. She did the arithmetic in her head in about 4 seconds. Combined with Hennessy's payment, it covered the bank deadline with a margin of just under $300, which was not comfortable, but was not nothing. "Done," she said, and put out her hand. He shook it with the slightly surprised expression of a man who expected one more round and didn't get it. "Paper," she said, and took out her notebook.
They started back the following morning with the cattle sold, the payment in a secured document case that Nathan kept inside his coat, and the particular silence that comes after something you've been working toward has actually happened, and you haven't fully processed it yet. About 2 hours out of Billings, Nathan said, "We did it." She looked at him. "The payment," he said. "Between Hennessy and Carver, we've got the payment." "We have enough for the payment," she said. We don't have the ranch stable yet." "I know that," he said. He stopped. "Can we have 1 hour of knowing we made the payment before we start on the next problem?" She looked at him. His profile, the scar along his jaw that had healed crooked, the eyes that hadn't had enough sleep in probably years. "1 hour," she said. He nodded once. And for about 20 minutes, neither of them said anything, but it was different from the silence of the first morning. It had some air in it. Then Nathan said quietly, "My father would have liked you." She didn't answer right away. "Why?" "Because you're like him. You see what something should be and you work toward it without needing it to be easy. He was like that." He paused. "I don't think I inherited it the same way. I have to work harder for it." "That might make you better at it," she said. "Things that don't come naturally. You think about them more. You're more careful. Or you just feel like you're failing more often." "Sometimes it's both at the same time." He considered that. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it is." They rode another mile before he spoke again. "When this is settled, the debt, Rourke, all of it, what do you want? For yourself, not for the ranch." The question caught her off guard, which almost nothing did. She sat with it for a moment. "I want the smokehouse to run the way I know it can run," she said. "I want the operation to be something that lasts, not just this season, but 10 years from now, 20. She paused. "I want to not be afraid of the supply lines failing because someone has decided to take what we've built." "That's still mostly about the ranch," he said. "I know." She thought about it honestly. "I think what I want and what the ranch needs are the same thing right now. Maybe later they'll be different, but right now I can't separate them." Nathan was quiet for a while. Then, "I want that too. All of it." A pause. "And I want to sleep without running numbers in my head until 3 in the morning." "That one might take longer," she said. "I know," he said. And this time he did smile, properly, the first real one she'd seen from him, and it changed his whole face in a way that made him look younger and tired and honest all at once. She looked back at the road. Her chest did something she wasn't going to examine too closely right now. There was work still ahead. They arrived back at the ranch on the 6th day, 1 day later than planned because the weather that Clara had watched building over the second ridge had come through during the night of day 4 and turned the road back into something that required patience and care, and 2 hours spent getting the wagon free from a ditch that should not have been as deep as it was. Walter met them at the gate. His face told her before he spoke. "Rourke is here," Walter said. "Nathan was off the wagon before it fully stopped." "Where?" "Ranch house. He arrived yesterday morning. He has a man with him, Garrett, and a document." Walter's voice stayed flat. "He says the bank has authorized an early review of the debt status based on deteriorating operational conditions. He wants to see the accounts." "He can't do that," Nathan said. "The deadline isn't for another—" "He has a letter from the bank," Walter said. "I don't know if it's legitimate. I didn't let him in the house. He's been waiting in the yard." Clara stepped down from the wagon. Every part of her was tired and cold, and she had been in the same clothes for 6 days, and she had 600 miles of bad road sitting in her muscles. And Victor Rourke had chosen this exact moment because that's what men like him did. They timed their moves for when you were most depleted. She understood that. She had counted on it, in a way. "Get the documentation," she said to Nathan. "Both copies. Bring them to the front of the house." "Clara." "Nathan." She met his eyes. "We have the bank payment. We have the Hennessy contract. We have 7 weeks of signed and witnessed records. He has a letter he probably paid someone to write." She paused. "Let's go talk to him." Victor Rourke was not what she'd built him to be in her mind over the past weeks, which she supposed was a lesson in itself. She'd imagined him larger, more theatrical. The reality was a man in his late 50s in a good coat with a politician's face, the kind that could be warm or cold depending on what the situation required, and showed neither one authentically. He was standing in the yard with Garrett beside him and his hands in his coat pockets. And when Clara and Nathan came around from the gate, he looked at Clara for a half-second longer than he looked at Nathan, the way people do when they're recalibrating something. "Nathan," Rourke said warmly, like they were old friends, "I heard you'd been traveling. I hope the roads weren't too difficult." "Victor," Nathan said, with none of the warmth returned. Rourke looked at Clara. "Mrs. Caldwell, I've heard a great deal about you." "I don't doubt it," she said. He produced the letter from his coat. "I won't drag this out. The bank has some concerns about the operational status of this property, given the outstanding debt. And as a party with a financial interest in the resolution of that debt, I've been authorized to do what, exactly?" Clara asked. He paused. He wasn't used to being interrupted. "To assess. I read the bank's terms when I arrived on this property," she said. "The terms as originally written give no third party the right to assess operations before a payment deadline, which means if that letter says otherwise, someone changed the terms." She looked at him directly. Again. The warmth in Rourke's face adjusted itself. Not gone, but recalculated. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," she said. "I'm stating that we have documentation of this operation going back 7 weeks, signed and witnessed, and that we have the funds to cover the bank payment in full." She looked at Garrett. "Tell Mr. Rourke what Ridgeline Provisions is." Garrett's face went carefully blank. Rourke looked at Garrett, then back at Clara. "I don't know what you—" "A shell company registered 6 weeks ago," she said. "Appeared to have a supply contract with Hennessy around the time our own arrangement with Hennessy was developing. Disappeared when Hennessy looked into it, which he did because I wrote him a letter." She paused. "We also have a witness to the conversation between your man Garrett and one of our ranch hands that preceded the sabotage of our smokehouse last month." She didn't look at Dutch or Roy. She didn't need to. "And we have the dates and specifics of 3 supply deliveries to this ranch that were registered with the supplier but never arrived, along with the fact that those suppliers all have financial relationships with your distribution network." Rourke's politician face had been doing significant work during this. It was still doing work, but something behind it had shifted. The calculation had changed, and she could see him running new numbers. "You can't prove any connection between my business and—" "Not in court," she said. "Not today. That's not what I'm doing today." She held his gaze. "What I'm doing today is telling you clearly and with witnesses present that we have documentation of everything I just described, and that documentation exists in more than one place, and that if anything happens to this ranch, its operation, its property, or any person on it, that documentation goes to the Territorial Governor's Office, the Federal Land Commission, and every legitimate business operator in a 200-mile radius who might be considering a transaction with you." The yard was very quiet. Walter was standing to the left, still as a fence post. Eli had appeared from somewhere and was near the barn. Even Thomas was visible, near the smokehouse, not pretending to do something else. Rourke looked at Nathan. "Are you going to let your wife—" "Yes," Nathan said simply. Rourke looked back at Clara. The warmth was gone now. What replaced it was something colder and more honest, and in some ways easier to deal with. The real face underneath the politician's face, the one that had looked at struggling ranches for years and seen only assets waiting to be collected. "The debt is still real," he said. "Quiet now, careful." "The debt is real," she agreed, "and we're paying it, in full, next week." She paused. "Is there anything else you needed?" He looked at her for a long moment, then at Nathan, then back at her. He put the letter back in his coat pocket. "I think we're done here," he said. "We are," she said. He said nothing further. He nodded once, not graciously, not warmly, just the mechanical acknowledgement of a man who has run the calculation and found it no longer works in his favor. And he walked back to where his horse was tied, and Garrett followed, and they left the way they'd come. Clara watched until they were through the gate. Then she let herself breathe. The payment was made on a Tuesday, in person, at the Billings branch, with Nathan and Clara both present and Walter's signature on the documentation and the bank officer across the desk who would not quite meet their eyes when he confirmed the receipt. She thought about asking him directly whether he knew Victor Rourke. She decided against it. Some fights you pick and some fights you leave for when you have the resources to finish them properly. The debt was cleared. The ranch was safe. Rourke had retreated, which didn't mean he was gone forever, but it meant they had time and a running operation and a contract with Hennessy and documented evidence that hadn't existed 3 months ago. That was enough for today. They rode back to the ranch without the urgency that had characterized every trip for the last weeks, and Clara noticed the difference in her own body, the specific absence of the low-grade tension that had been sitting under everything since she'd arrived. It didn't feel like victory exactly. It felt like the moment after you've been holding something heavy for a very long time and you put it down, and your arms are still shaking from the effort, but the thing is down. Spring came to the Caldwell Ranch the way spring came to Montana. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. Cold mornings, warm afternoons, late frosts that killed the optimistic early growth and then relented and let it grow back. By March, the Smokehouse was running at the middle range of output that Clara had promised Hennessy, and by April it was touching the upper range on good weeks, and Eli Parker was managing 2 of the junior workers himself with a quiet competence that still surprised people who hadn't been watching him develop all winter. Walter told her one afternoon, with the same flat directness he brought to everything, that he hadn't seen the ranch in this condition since Nathan's father was alive. "Better in some ways," he said. "How so?" she asked. "The records," he said. "The documentation. The planning." He looked at the Smokehouse, running steady. Nathan's father ran on instinct and experience, both very good, but instinct dies with the man who has it. He looked at Clara. "What you've built here, someone else can read and follow. It doesn't die." She thought about that for a while. She thought about her own father's business, everything he'd known in his head, not written down, not passed on, and how when he died the knowledge went with him and she'd had to reconstruct it from nothing in the worst possible circumstances. She'd made herself write things down because of that loss. She'd made herself document and verify and record because she knew what it cost when those things didn't exist. It was a strange kind of inheritance. The lesson her father gave her was the lesson of his failure, and she'd made it into a practice that outlasted both him and the failure. She didn't say any of that to Walter. It felt too close. "The next generation of this ranch will know exactly what we did and how," she said instead. "That's the point." Walter nodded. That was enough for him. On a Friday evening in late April, Nathan came to find her at the Smokehouse. She was doing the weekly output count with Eli, who had developed a system of his own for the recording that was more efficient than the one she'd designed, which she'd adopted without comment, and he'd been almost painfully pleased about. "Someone's asking for you," Nathan said. She looked up. "Who?" "Peterson, from the supply store in town." He leaned in the doorway. He said, and this is his wording, not mine, that he wanted to apologize to the woman who turned the Caldwell operation around and also to ask whether you'd be willing to talk to 2 other ranchers in the area who are struggling. Eli looked at Clara. Clara looked at Nathan. "What kind of struggling?" she asked. "The kind that looks familiar?" Nathan said. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about what Peterson was really asking. Whether the thing she'd built here was something that could be taken somewhere else, applied again, made useful beyond this one property. She thought about her father, who had kept everything in his head. She thought about the documentation notebooks sitting on the shelf in her workroom, which anyone could read. "Tell Peterson to bring them by on Monday," she said. "We'll talk." Nathan's expression did that thing again. That thing that had started in the smokehouse the night he'd come to see the first smoke, when something that had been shut for a long time opened a little. He was better at letting it open now. He didn't rush to close it as quickly. "Monday," he said. "And Nathan," she said. He looked at her. "You can stop standing in doorways," she said. "You live here too." Something shifted in his face, relief, and something warmer underneath it that neither of them had found the exact word for yet, though they had time, and time had a way of providing words eventually. He walked in. Eli, with the particular tact of a 19-year-old who had learned more about reading a room than most people twice his age, suddenly found something very important to check on the far side of the smokehouse. Clara went back to her count. The fire in the pit burned steady. The smoke drew through the channels the way it was supposed to draw. Outside, the Montana spring was arguing with itself the way it always did, cold and warm in the same hour, refusing to commit. Inside, the numbers were good, not perfect. They were never perfect. There was always a short month, always something that needed fixing, always a gap between what you planned and what the world agreed to give you. But good, solid. The kind of numbers that didn't keep you up until 3 a.m. because you already knew what they said. She wrote the final count in the notebook, signed it, dated it. She'd arrived on this ranch with one trunk and a plan that nobody believed in. She hadn't saved it by being fearless. She'd been afraid plenty. Of the numbers. Of Rourke. Of the moment when the promise she'd made out loud would be tested against what she could actually deliver. Fear wasn't the thing you got rid of. It was the thing you carried and worked alongside, like a bad shoulder that still lifts its share. What she'd learned, what the ranch had taught her, or maybe what she'd always known, and this place had finally given her room to prove, was that the strongest thing in any fight wasn't the person with the most resources or the least conscience. It was the person who kept their records straight, told the truth in writing, and didn't stop working when things got hard. Victor Rourke had money and influence and relationships and time. She'd had a notebook in 7 weeks. The notebook won. Nathan stood beside her, looking at the output numbers over her shoulder with the quiet interest of a man who had finally stopped being afraid of what the numbers might say. "Good week," he said. "Good week," she agreed. She closed the notebook and put it on the shelf next to the others. All of them, all 7 weeks of them, a record of everything they'd built and how. Someone could read that record 20 years from now and know exactly what had happened here. That mattered to her, more than the victory, more than Rourke backing down, more than the payment made and the contract signed. The work was documented. It would last. That was the whole point.